Most often we think of somebody either sitting or lying down. If they're sitting, we might imagine them in the so-called lotus position, sitting with legs crossed, very upright with hands on the knees, or, crossed in our lap or something of that sort. Typically, we think of somebody who's in a very calm state, eyes closed, focused on their so-called third eye center. The third eye center is the area just behind one's forehead. There's no third eye there. At least there shouldn't be. But I'll tell you why it's called the third eye center, what the origins of that are, and why it's relevant actually for a meditative practice. With all that said, it turns out that meditation encompasses a huge variety of different practices. Some of those practices indeed are done sitting or lying down with one's eyes closed, focusing on the third eye center. Other of those practices are focused on a body scan, really focusing on one area of the body and its contact with whatever surface you happen to be sitting or lying on. Or can be done walking. In fact, there are walking meditations done with eyes open. So there are many different forms of meditation, but today we are going to focus mainly on how specific types of meditation and specific areas of the brain that are activated during those meditations change our way of being in fundamental ways, not just during the meditation practice, but afterwards as well. So if you're somebody who's interested in changing your default state of mood or of thinking or enhancing your ability to focus or improving your sleep or improving performance in some cognitive or physical endeavor, meditation is powerful, but you want to make sure that you pick the right meditation practice. So we will talk about picking a meditation practice that isn't just feasible because you'll do it, but is actually directed at the goals specific to you and what you need most. So to give you some sense of the contour of today's episode, first I'm going to talk about some of the underlying biology, the mechanisms and the brain areas and also the areas of the body that are activated during certain forms of meditation, and equally important, which areas of the brain and body are shut down or reduced in their activity during specific types of meditation. Then I'll transition into how to best do a meditation practice, how to get the most out of that meditation practice. And then I will talk about how to change or alter your meditation practices according to your specific goals and as you get better at meditation. And this can get a little bit counterintuitive, but in a positive way. What I mean by that is, for instance, a lot of people think that as you meditate and get better at meditating, you need to meditate more and more and more. Sort of like if you get better at running endurance races, that you need to keep running longer and longer. First a 5K, then a 10K, then a marathon, then ultras. With meditation, it's actually quite the opposite. The better that you get at dropping into a particular brain state, and the more your so-called traits of brain state shift, not just states as they're sometimes referred to, but traits. This is a theme that I've picked up from a terrific book that I'll refer to later. But the more that you can get into specific neural circuits quickly, actually, the less you need to meditate in order to derive the benefits of meditation. So that's a wonderful aspect of meditative practices that's unlike a lot of other forms of mental exercise and cognitive enhancing exercises. So we'll talk about all of that today. And I promise that by the end of today's episode, you will have a rich array of meditative practices to select from. You'll know why each of them work and why they can be directed toward particular goals and how to do that. And you'll also know how to modify those meditation practices under conditions where you might get busier or where you're suffering from lack of sleep. I think a lot of people will be excited to know that today we're going to discuss a specific form of meditation that can indeed reduce your need for sleep and still allow you to enhance your cognitive and physical abilities. Before patterns of thinking and breathing, maybe people sitting in the lotus position, but more often than that, it would be people inside of an MRI magnet, because it is a magnet, so put you into a little tube and push you into the tube, not against your will, of course, but put people into the tube, have them meditate, and then look at how the brain changed, and to do that over time. When those studies were done, what was discovered was really quite miraculous, really. And now we don't think of it as surprising, but what was discovered was a huge laundry list of brain changes. And then when people were evaluated in their outside life, so when they would fill out reports of their subjective feelings of happiness, or they would report their sleep, or even if objective measures were taken, changes in hormones or markers of inflammation, etc., a large list of information fell out of that, which revealed that indeed there are many, a dozen or more, clear benefits of a regular meditation practice. And some of those meditation practices could be quite short. So nowadays we think of meditation as pretty commonly accepted. And in fact, that has a lot to do with the fact that many of the major tech companies in the Bay Area during the 2000s, such as Google and Apple and any number of different social media companies and other companies and business ventures, et cetera, and investment firms all over the world, started hiring people to train meditation or had online courses for meditation. So nowadays we think of meditation as this thing that almost everybody understands can benefit us. But we now sit at an interesting frontier where most people think of meditation as one thing. So like the word exercise, which of course could mean weight training, it could mean running, it could mean high intensity interval training, all of which, as you know, will get you different results depending on what you do, how often you do it, and the specifics of what you actually do. So too, meditation can give you very specific results. It can give you more focus. It can give you better sleep. It can give you a combination of results, just like exercise can, depending on the exercise. So what we're going to talk about next is the specific changes that happen in the brain with specific aspects of meditation. That is, what happens when you close your eyes? What happens when you focus your attention inward versus focusing your attention outward? Because as I mentioned before, there's third eye meditation where you close your eyes and focus on that spot just behind your forehead, and you focus on your breathing. There's also meditation practices where you're focusing on what you're eating with a lot of so-called mindfulness, being very present to whatever's happening, not letting your mind wander or think about yesterday or tomorrow, what's happening next, but really focusing on the present. There are also meditation practices, of course, where you are in a format of interpersonal communication, where you're really listening very intensely. That, too, is a form of mindfulness. So we're going to parse each of these things, and we are going to ask what's happening in the brain and body during each of these meditation practices so that you can develop specific meditation practices that you can invoke in your real life on a daily basis, or thankfully, I would say for some who are pretty busy, that you could even do once a week or even once a month that will still clearly benefit you in specific ways. I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about the neuroscience of meditation. I promise you I'm not going to just list off a bunch of different brain areas that are active during meditation. That wouldn't be useful to you. In fact, I don't believe in throwing out a lot of nomenclature without also giving some mechanistic explanation as to what different brain areas do. And you could say, well, what good is it knowing what different brain areas do and their names if I can't actually manipulate those brain areas? But the good news is you actually can manipulate those brain areas. As I'll tell you today, you can turn up the activity in certain brain areas and turn down the activity in specific brain areas with specific elements of a meditation practice. So that's quite exciting and quite different, really, from other aspects of neuroscience that we might discuss on this podcast. So there are a few different brain areas whose names I'd like to arm you with. And again, the names themselves aren't essential, but if you can grasp even the top contour of what I'm about to say, you'll be in a much better position to parse and use the information that follows. There's an area of your brain that sits right behind your forehead that's called the prefrontal cortex. Basically, it's the front bumper of your head, just behind the bone, okay? That area just behind your forehead that we call the prefrontal cortex actually encompasses a lot of different things. And actually, you have two of them. You have one on the right side of your brain and you have one on the left side of your brain. And they're connected to one another, but they actually do different things. The area that I'd like to focus on today for a bit is the so-called left prefrontal cortex. Or if we were going to get really specific, we'd say the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Dorsal means up, lateral means to the side. So if you want to touch the left side of your head and move your hand just toward the midline, toward the sort of top of your head a little bit, so that's dorsal. And then lateral, as long as your hand is still on the side of your head, you're in the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, so you've got your hand probably right over your left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That area of the brain we know from lesion studies where it's been damaged in animals or humans, and we know from stimulation studies where it's been selectively stimulated in animals, or yes, indeed, also it's been done in humans, has an incredible ability to control your bodily senses and to make sense, that is to interpret what's going on in terms of your emotions and your bodily sensations. So from now on, unless I say otherwise, if I say prefrontal cortex, I'm specifically referring to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but I'm going to shorten that up just for sake of simplicity and ease of communication. If I'm going to talk about another area of prefrontal cortex, I'll talk about another area. But if I say prefrontal cortex today, what I mean is left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Stimulation of left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or I should say more appropriately, when your left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is active, you are in a great position to interpret what's going on with you emotionally, to interpret your bodily signals of comfort or discomfort, and then to make really good decisions on the basis of that interpretation. And that's because the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is in direct communication with and is directly connected to another brain area called the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC. Now, I'm just going to refer to it as the ACC, okay? The ACC is an area of your brain that is interpreting a lot of different things about bodily signals. For instance, how fast you're breathing, whether or not your heart is beating quickly or slowly, and more importantly, whether or not your heart is beating quickly or slowly for the circumstance that you are in. So for instance, if you're running up a hill and you're even in great shape and your heart is beating very fast, it's unlikely that you are going to be concerned about your heart beating fast because that is appropriate for the circumstance. However, if you're just walking along and all of a sudden your heart starts beating very quickly for no apparent reason, well then you are going to interpret that as either pathologic or uncomfortable, inappropriate for the context that you happen to be in.
Bro, I gave you a host, dude.
The left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain that actually has some control over and especially can interpret what's going on in this ACC region. Now, most of you probably haven't heard of the ACC. Most of you probably have heard of a brain area called the amygdala. It's an almond-shaped structure on the two sides of the brain. People talk about it as the fear center, etc. But your ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, gets input from areas like the amygdala, your threat detection centers, but it also gets input from an enormous number of other areas of your brain and body, including your heart, your gut. So it gets information about how full that is distended or how empty your gut is. It gets information about how quickly you're breathing from input from your lungs and related structures. It's an absolutely critical station for making sense of what's going on in your body. And it works very closely along with one other structure. And I promise this is going to be the third structure in this triad, and then I'll stop listing off names. So we have dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Think of that as sort of the interpreter of what's going on inside of you. You have the ACC, or anterior cingulate cortex, which is the area of your brain that's bringing in all this information about what's going on inside your body, and even on the surface of your body. You know, if you have any pain or an itch or a mosquito bite on the surface of your body, your ACC would definitely register that. And then there's this other absolutely incredible brain structure, which is called the insula, I-N-S-U-L-A, insula. And the insula has a bunch of different parts to it. But the insula is another area that is interpreting signals of what's going on in your brain and body. So the ACC and the insula are working together to try and figure out, you know, what's going on inside me. And in addition to that, the insula is interpreting information about what's going on outside of you. So your insula is saying, for instance, hey, this is a steep hill that I'm running up. And as a consequence, whatever heart rate increase that I'm experiencing or heavy breathing or burning in my lungs, this all makes sense. I don't have to be worried. I don't have to be scared. I might want to slow down, but this makes sense. Whereas for instance, in the example I previously gave, where if you're sitting in a room and everything is pretty calm and all of a sudden you start feeling really uncomfortable, like your stomach doesn't feel right, or you start breathing quickly, or you start having a so-called anxiety or panic attack, in large part that's because the shift in your bodily sensations doesn't match or doesn't correspond to something in the outside world. So there's this incredible triad which includes the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the cingulate or anterior cingulate cortex, and the insula. And those three are working together in a kind of conversation. It's a neural conversation, but a conversation nonetheless, trying to figure out, okay, what's going on inside me? How do I feel? What am I thinking about? And this could be thoughts about the past or the future or the present. They are also in a conversation as to whether or not the sensations that you're experiencing, meaning how quick your breathing is or how slow your breathing is, how your heart feels, how your skin feels, any sensations of pain or pleasure for that matter, whether or not that makes sense for the situation you're in, and trying to determine whether or not you are doing the right things as a consequence of those sensations. Okay, so again, if you can't remember the names of these different neural structures in the brain, don't worry about it. It's really not that critical. What is critical is that you understand that there's a conversation that's constantly occurring as long as you are awake, trying to figure out what's going on inside of you and whether or not it makes sense relative to what's going on outside and around you. Now, humans are smart. That is, we are, to some extent, conscious of the fact that we have memories of the past, awareness of the present, and anticipation of the future. So we do realize, for instance, that we can be seated at the dinner table, and have a thought about something tomorrow, maybe an exam that's stressing us out or something like that, and that will change our bodily state in a way that is not optimal for what we're doing in the moment, but that can still make sense to us because that exam is important. Maybe we're feeling some pressure about a hard conversation we have to have, or maybe we are very excited about the next day and we can't eat because we're so excited, and that can make perfect sense to us because we do have access to this knowledge about self that we can think about the past, the present, or the future. So that makes the conversation these three structures are in even more interesting and dynamic, because what it means is that we can be doing something, eating, talking, running, any number of different activities, and our bodily state may or may not match what we are doing in a way that's adaptive for that, and yet that can be completely okay or at least understandable for us. Now, a major emphasis of a meditation practice is to make us so-called more mindful. What is mindfulness? Well, again, there isn't one perfect, universally accepted operational definition of mindfulness. That's basically nerd speak for saying people can't agree exactly what mindfulness should be, is, and means for everyone. But most people assume, and I think agree, that mindfulness includes something about being present. And when I say present, that doesn't necessarily mean present to one's surroundings, because of course a lot of meditation practices that are designed to make us more mindful and present are designed to make us more mindful and present to what's happening internally while ignoring everything that's happening externally. But they are designed to make us more present to our bodily sensations, and in particular our breathing and our thoughts in the moment. So let's now explore what a generic meditation practice looks like, and let's evaluate how that tends to change the activity of these neural circuits in the brain and body. And then from there, we can split the conversation into a couple of different bins. That is, meditation practices that are ideal for enhancing focus, meditation practices that are ideal for improving mood, meditation practices that are ideal for improving sleep, and meditation practices that, believe it or not, benefit all of those things in one fell swoop. Okay, so what happens during a meditation practice at the neural level? In order to answer that question, we are going to be scientists. That means you and I are going to be scientists now. We are going to break down a practice into its different component parts and address what we know for sure about the brain activation states that occur with those different component parts. In order to do that, let's use a somewhat generic form of meditation, but it's generic and pretty far-reaching, because I would say that for most people, about 75%, let's say, a meditation practice is going to involve stopping, meaning getting out of motion, sitting or lying down, and in most cases closing one's eyes, although it is absolutely not required to close one's eyes during meditation. There are many forms of meditation that are done eyes open. But for most people, it's going to involve stopping our movement, that is not ambulating, not walking or running, so seated or lying down with eyes closed. When we do that, meaning when we sit or lie down and close our eyes, as trivial as that shift might sound to you, it actually is a profound shift in the way that your brain and other neural circuits in your body function, for the following reason. When we close our eyes, we shut down a major avenue of what's called exteroception. What do I mean by exteroception? Well, very briefly, we are sensing things on our body and in our body all the time. We are also sensing things from outside of us all the time. So these can be sights or sounds, touch on our body, sensations with inside our body, etc. Now, sensation is distinct from what we call perception. Perception is, put simply, the sensations that we happen to be paying attention to. So at any given moment, you are sensing many, many things. There are sound waves hitting your ears, there are pressure receptors on the bottoms of your feet sensing your shoes or your sandals or the floor, etc., but you're not perceiving them until you place your attention on them. Now, the way perception works is that you have so-called spotlights of attention. You can't perceive everything all at once. Every sound, every sight, every touch. That would be overwhelming. In fact, that would be terrible. Rather, you have spotlights of perception that can either be very narrow. So for instance, you could focus all of your perception right now on your big toe of your right foot and really pour all of your awareness, your attention, into what you're perceiving there, what it feels like, if there's tingling or pressure, heat or cold, etc. Or you can broaden that spotlight to include both feet or all your toes on both feet, and then your legs and your whole body or the entire room. perception is like a spotlight, and I should mention there are very good data that we can split our attention into two, but probably not more than two spotlights. And we can make those spotlights of perception either very broad and diffuse or very narrow. You can practice this now if you like. You can pick a spot on the wall away from you anywhere, or if you're driving, you can look at some location, and you can focus intensely on one small location. For instance, a tree in the horizon, or a person on the street, or any number of different things outside of you. Or you can broaden that spotlight to include the entire scene at once. You can also focus a spotlight of perception on your body, say on the left upper portion of your chest.
What the fuck?
And, of course, you can focus on the left upper portion of your chest and something outside of you. You can split your attention between those two perceptual spotlights. It's very hard, although not impossible, to have three perceptual spotlights. But most people can split to 2 points of attention or perception pretty easily. The other thing that most people can do pretty easily is merge those two spotlights, or rather to have just one spotlight of attention. So you don't always have to have two spotlights of attention on. And here I'm using the word attention and perception interchangeably. But you could, for instance, have 2 points of attention. So you're talking to somebody and you're paying attention to whether or not somebody's walking in the door or not. So that's 2. Or you could be completely focused on the person you're talking to. Or you could be completely focused on the stomach ache or the great sensation of hunger that you have in your belly while talking to somebody. In fact, you're not even listening to what they're saying at all. Okay, so you have 2 spotlights of perception. You can split them or merge them into one. And this is very important. Those spotlights of perception can intensify or dim. And there I'm using analogy. What I mean by that is your perception of what's happening within those spotlights can be very, very high acuity. That is, you can register very fine changes in detail, like tingling on one side of your big toe of your right foot versus the other. Or it can be somewhat more diffuse. You're just thinking about your whole toe, which in that case seems like a small area. But the point is that you can consciously adjust the acuity, that is the fineness of your perception. All of this is under your power because of the incredible ability of a brain structure whose name you now understand and know, which is the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Although there are other areas of your brain involved as well, your ability to direct your attention to specific things in your environment or within your body, or to split those points of attention or merge them or dial up the intensity of how closely you're paying attention to every little shift or ripple and change in sensation there, or to kind of dissociate, if you will, for lack of a better word, to disengage from that perception. All of that is under control because of your ability to engage this area that we call the prefrontal cortex, and in particular the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens, now called AG1, is a vitamin mineral probiotic drink that covers all of your foundational nutritional needs. I've been taking Athletic Greens since 2012, so I'm delighted that they're sponsoring the podcast. The reason I started taking Athletic Greens and the reason I still take Athletic Greens once or usually twice a day is that it gets me the probiotics that I need for gut health. Our gut is very important. It's populated by gut microbiota that communicate with the brain, the immune system, and basically all the biological systems of our body to strongly impact our immediate and long-term health. And those probiotics in Athletic Greens are optimal and vital for microbiotic health. In addition, Athletic Greens contains a number of adaptogens, vitamins, and minerals that make sure that all of my foundational nutritional needs are met, and it tastes great. If you'd like to try Athletic Greens, you can go to athleticgreens.com/Huberman, and they'll give you 5 free travel packs that make it really easy to mix up Athletic Greens while you're on the road, in the car, on the plane, etc. And they'll give you a year's supply of vitamin D3K2. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Huberman to get the 5 free travel packs and the year's supply of vitamin D3K2. Okay, so now if we look at the example of what happens when you sit or lie down and close your eyes and decide to meditate, you should immediately realize that that's a tremendous shift in your perceptual ability. Why? Because that spotlight of attention, while it can be oriented toward, for instance, what you hear in the room, or maybe the feeling of wind moving trees in the environment that you happen to be in, when we close our eyes, we shut down one of the major avenues for sensory input, which is vision. And when we do that, there's a tendency for those perceptual spotlights to be focused more so on what happens at the level of the surface of our skin and inside of our bodies. And that informs us about something very important, which is that there are actually two axes or two ends of a continuum of perception. Now, up until now, I've been talking about perception and intention as kind of the same thing, and indeed they are, at least for sake of this conversation. But within that word perception, or within that word attention, there's a continuum. And that continuum has on one end something called interoception. Interoception, spelled with an I, is everything that we sense at the level of our skin and inward. So the sensation inside our stomach, the sensation of our heart beating. Some people can sense their heart beating pretty easily. Other people have more challenge doing that. What we are feeling on the surface of our skin, how hot or cold we feel. That's interoception. In contrast, at the other end of the continuum is so-called exteroception, spelled with an E. Exteroception is perception of everything that's outside or beyond the confines of our skin. So by shutting our eyes, and in particular in a meditative practice where we direct our attention toward our so-called third eye center, this area right behind our forehead, which not so incidentally is the prefrontal cortex, or in some cases where people will focus on their breathing, so the movement of their stomach or the movement of their diaphragm or the lifting of their chest or the extension of their belly while they breathe. By doing that, we are taking what ordinarily is a perceptual state that's split between the outside world, exteroception, and usually also toward our inner state. You know, most people are generally in touch with how they are feeling from the skin inward, while they are also paying attention to what's outside of them. You can think about somebody, for instance, at a restaurant or sandwich shop about to order a sandwich and you're reading the menu. So that's exteroception, right? The menu is outside the confines of your skin. And little ideas or maybe big ideas come to mind about what the roast beef sandwich or the vegetarian sandwich will taste like, what it will do for you, what's in it, what you like, what you don't like, etc. That's splitting interoception and exteroception. But when we close our eyes, we stop, we slow down, we focus on our breathing or that third eye center, the majority of our perception then shifts to interoception. And when we shift down to that end of the continuum of interoception, something very important happens. What happens is that those two regions, the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the insula, really ramp up their levels of neural activity. And that should make perfect sense to you because those are areas of your brain that are registering and paying attention to the various sensations of how full or empty your stomach feels, whether or not the surface of your skin feels hot or cold, and on and on. So by just sitting down or lying down and closing your eyes, your brain undergoes a massive shift from exteroception to interoception. Now, that's not to say you can't be distracted by external events, and in fact, many people are. But the early stages of transitioning into a meditative state involve this shift down the continuum, or I should say to one end of the continuum, because there's no down up, there's just the continuum. Shift along the continuum to heightened levels of interoception. Now, I mentioned this briefly before, but
Oh my God.
many people are very interoceptively aware, just naturally, even if they don't do a meditation practice. Other people are not. And there's a pretty good measure of whether or not you have high levels of interoceptive awareness or capability. And that is your ability to count your heartbeats without placing your fingers anywhere with any pressure to take your pulse. You can do this if you like. You can actually try and estimate your number of heartbeats simply by trying to feel your heart beat. Some people are very good, meaning they're very accurate at doing this. Other people are not. It does seem to be an ability that can be trained up quite a bit. And in fact, meditative practices will improve your interoceptive awareness. But, and this is a very important point, heightened levels of interoceptive awareness, while that might sound attractive, but to really in touch with your body, that is not always beneficial. Why? Because many people who, for instance, have excessive levels of anxiety have excessive levels of anxiety because they are very keenly aware of any subtle shift in their heart rate or breathing or change in the sensations within their stomach. Whereas other people who are less aware of their bodily state, that can be beneficial, right? It can be adaptive or not, depending on the circumstances. It's probably not adaptive to be very, very aware of your internal state. If, for instance, you're doing public speaking, you don't want to be thinking about what's going on in your stomach or how quickly you're breathing. I'm certainly trying to ignore all those signals, those sensations now. But for somebody who has no awareness of what's going on, very little interoceptive awareness, that can be problematic too, because these are the very people who can ignore the fact that they're having a heart attack or can ignore the fact that they have high blood pressure and are caring about life, focused on everything external with no awareness of their own body. They're, quote unquote, out of touch with their body. So we want to be very careful about placing valence, which is a sort of value of good or bad, on interoceptive awareness versus exteroceptive awareness. More importantly, we want to emphasize that when you undergo a meditation practice, if it's of the sort where you stop your movement and close your eyes, you are training for interoceptive awareness. This becomes important later. We get into discussions about meditation for reducing anxiety. Some people may opt, in fact, I would say some people ought to opt for a meditative practice which involves more exteroceptive awareness, actually a meditation like a walking meditation or even a seated meditation where they are bringing their focus to a place outside their body as opposed to inside their body. And in fact, there are examples of people who have meditated quite a lot who develop such a heightened state or awareness of their interoceptive components, that is just fancy, again, nerd speak, for so aware of their breathing and of their heart and of the state of their gut that it actually is intrusive for daily activities. So I will ask you to ask this question of yourself now. Are you somebody who tends to be very in touch with your bodily sensations? So for instance, from the skin inwards. Or are you somebody who tends to be less in touch with or aware of your interoceptive state? There is no right or wrong answer. You don't get an A or an F or a D or a C depending on your answer. It's just a good question for each and every one of us to answer. And I think most people will answer that it depends. It depends on whether or not you are in a social setting or whether or not you're alone. But we are going to return to that answer. So keep it in mind, because it will become very beneficial in building an optimal meditation practice for you. But for now, just know there's this continuum of perception, interoception and exteroception. Closing your eyes increases interoception. Opening your eyes dramatically increases exteroception, just automatically. Because so much of your brain, in fact, 40% or more, is dedicated to vision. And this, I should say, for those of you that are low vision or no vision, and those of you that are blind or have poor vision, this entire process is translated to the auditory, to the sound domain. So it's true for people that can see, that's true for people that can't see. Of course, people that can't see, closing the eyes doesn't have this huge shift towards interoception, but there have been a few studies, not as many as I would have liked to find, but a few studies of, for instance, people who are blind or have low vision, don't see very well, and when they close their ears and they can't hear the external world, or they put headphones on or noise-canceling headphones, then the world inside of them becomes very prominent relative to the world outside of them for obvious reasons. So I asked you to ask yourself whether or not you are somebody who tends to be more interoceptively aware or not, more exteroceptively aware or not. And some of you might not be able to answer that question, and if you can't, chances are that you are effectively sliding along that continuum depending on the activities that you're doing. So you're probably the kind of person where if somebody comes over to you and starts talking to you, you will engage in that conversation, and you don't feel so inside your body that you're thinking about your heart beating and whether or not you're flushing red, etc. You're going to pay attention to what they say. Many people, however, when somebody talks to them, if they have social anxiety or even a slight bit of social anxiety, will be thinking about whether or not their cheeks are flushing or whether or not they look right or sound right or whether or not they have something in their teeth. These are normal responses, but they really speak to this issue of whether or not you tend to shift more towards interoceptive awareness or exteroceptive awareness. And of course, it's context dependent. It will depend on whether or not you're out on a date with somebody that you would loathe to find out later that you had food in your teeth, or whether or not you're with somebody you're more familiar with where that would not really matter much, or the other person would tell you this kind of thing.
Oh my God.
What does it mean to be at one location or another location along this continuum of interoception or exteroception? Well, we know what it means neurally, right? We know that if you are more interoceptively aware, your insulin ACC are active, but that's not very useful. That's not helpful as a tool. That's just a fact. Now, there have actually been studies of what a meditation practice can do in terms of moving you along this continuum from where you naturally sit in order to help you function not just during the meditation, but at all times. And in order to illustrate this, I want to start with a description of what is now a classic study. It's a very cool study, has a very cool name, talks about something very important that will come up again and again in today's conversation. And that's something called the default mode network. The default mode network is a collection of different brain areas that essentially are active when we're not doing much of anything, and certainly is active when we are not focused on one particular task or conversation or activity. The default mode network can be thought of more or less as the network that generates mind wandering, or our thoughts drifting from the past to the present to the future. Remember earlier I talked about how your perceptual spotlight can either be two spotlights or they can merge. Well, similarly, human beings can think about the past, surely, the present, definitely, and the future. And it turns out we can also split our thoughts, just like we can split our perception, into two of those three things. So I can think about the past, a past event, and I can think about the present. I can split my thinking and my memory in that way. I can also think about the present and the future. I can also think about the future and the past, although it's very difficult, although not impossible, to split one's thinking and memory into the past, the present, and future simultaneously. Not easily done, but pretty easy to split one's attention and thinking into two of those three things, either the past, the present, and the future, or any two of those three things. Okay? Just like with attentional spotlighting, you can place your mind, your thinking, and your memory, your cognition onto one of those things to be very, very present, or the past and the present, and so on and so forth. The default mode network, while it involves a lot of different brain areas, can be thought of simply as the network of brain areas that are active when your mind is wandering between these different time domains. And the paper I'd like to share with you, as I mentioned before, is now a classic paper, has a wonderful title, which is "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." Now that sounds almost like a news article, or a news article about a scientific paper, but that's actually the title of the scientific paper, which was published in the journal Science, which is one of the three apex journals. Scientific publishing is competitive, but it's especially competitive to get manuscripts accepted into Science, into Nature, and into the journal Cell. So it represents kind of one of the Super Bowl, NBA championships, and Stanley Cup, if you will, for you sports aficionados of scientific publishing. This is a paper from Matthew Killingsworth and Dan Gilbert. It was published in 2010, but it's still considered a classic. And this paper, "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind," has a number of very important points. I'm going to paraphrase certain elements of it for you, because they say essentially what I would like you to know far better than I could say. So, first of all, they start out with a statement which I confess I disagree with, which is, unlike other animals, human beings spend a lot of time thinking about what is not going on around them, contemplating events that happened in the past, might happen in the future, or will never happen at all. I agree with their assertion that human beings do that. That's certainly my experience. Although I must say, I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that other animals don't do it also. So my apologies, Killingsworth and Gilbert, but I'd be happy to go toe-to-toe with you on that. I am not aware of any data that prove one way or the other what other animals are thinking. So let's set aside other animals and let's focus on the human animal. Now, their point is still a very good one, which is that humans have this wandering of the mind that they call stimulus-independent thought. That is, there's nothing happening to create these thoughts or anything happening in the immediate environment. These thoughts are just happening on their own, internally. That's the default network. This study was important. In fact, it was a landmark study because they did it right about the time that smartphones became widely available and in use. So again, 2010. So they basically pinged people, they contacted people on their iPhones many times per day, and they did this for well over 2,200 adults. They had a mix of male and female people in this study. The mean age was 34 years, but there was a range, mean average, but there were a range of different ages and so forth. And at any moment they asked people, what are you feeling right now? And they also asked them, what are you doing right now? So they were looking for the match or mismatch between what people were doing and what they were feeling. They were essentially trying to probe what people were thinking about, and they also addressed that. And they came up with a kind of a bubble chart, if you will, where the bigger the bubble, the more answers came back about one particular thing. And they assessed whether or not people were happy or not in that moment, or sad or not, whether or not they were focused on what they were doing or not. There are a lot of bubbles in this chart, so I'm not going to read them all. But the important points that came from the data, and again, there's a very large data set, was that, and here again I'm paraphrasing, first, people's minds wandered frequently, regardless of what they were doing. In nearly half of the samples taken, people were generally thinking about something else, except it turns out there's just one little bubble sitting way far out on the horizon here. People claimed, and I'm inclined to believe them, that they tend to be very focused on making love if they were making love in the moment where they were pinged on their iPhone. Now, why their iPhone was there with them at that moment, I don't know. That's wasn't included in this description of the study. But all the other activities, grooming and self-care, listening to the news, watching television, relaxing, working, etc., during all those activities, people claim that their mind wandered a lot. And then they also assessed, of course, their mood and how those people felt at any given moment, depending on what they were doing and how well their mind and their emotions matched what they were doing. And what they say here is, second, they revealed that people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not. And this was true during all activities. And then third, what people were thinking at a given moment was far better a predictor of their happiness than what they were doing. So this is interesting, and I think matches a lot of people's experience. In fact, I think as you hear about this study, many of you will probably just say, well, duh. I mean, if you're working and you don't like your work and you're thinking about something bad that happened, well, then of course you're not going to be happy. But the key point of this study is that it did not necessarily have to be the case that people were thinking about something unpleasant. In fact, if people were working and they were thinking about something else that was pleasant, that also made them feel unhappy. In other words, the mismatch between being in an activity and having our mind elsewhere led people to report themselves as feeling more unhappy in that moment. And when you total this up, what you find is that people are often not present to what they are doing, and that is a great source of unhappiness, even if their thoughts are those of happy, joyful thoughts. So this is interesting, and I think runs counter to what most of us have heard or have been taught, which is, think good thoughts, try and suppress bad thoughts, have a good internal landscape, create a good narrative. That is all true, but equally, if not more important, is to have the ability to be fully engaged in what you are doing at a given moment. That is the strongest predictor of being happy. And there were several other studies that followed up on this, but their conclusion that they put in the final short paragraph of this paper, I think really captures it beautifully. They say, and here I'm quoting directly, in conclusion, a human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. The ability to think about what is not happening in a moment, I added the in a moment part, is a cognitive achievement that comes at an emotional cost. So I know I'm not alone in believing that this paper, A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind, and we will provide a link to this paper in the show note caption, is absolutely key in understanding why a meditation practice is so important. Because a meditation practice is really about adjusting your place along that interoceptive, exteroceptive continuum to what you happen to be experiencing in that moment. And while most people think of a meditative practice as focusing on what's going on internally with your eyes closed, third eye center, focusing on your breathing, etc., for any number of minutes or maybe even an hour or longer, there are other forms of meditation in which your exteroception dominates, in which you are actively focusing on things outside or beyond the confines of your skin and internal landscape. And that too is meditation. And if we are to take the work of Killingsworth and Gilbert, this A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind, seriously, and I know a number of other laboratories have and have supported this research with their findings again and again and again, what this means is that meditating is not necessarily a practice that we do divorced from the rest of life. Meditation and mindfulness in particular, being present to what we are doing in a given moment, is one of the essential keys to happiness and improved mood, even if what we are doing is unpleasant. So that brings us to a tool, and it's a tool that any and all of us can use, whether or not you tend to be interoceptively dominant, that you tend to pay more attention to your bodily sensations, or exteroceptively dominant. And again, if you don't know the answer to that question, there's a simple test that you can do. You can just sit down or lie down, close your eyes, and you can ask yourself or assess whether or not your attention tends to fleet to things outside of you, right? Cars honking or going by, people in the room, or whether or not you tend to be able to focus on your internal landscape to the exclusion of exteroception and attention to things outside the confines of your skin easily. Now, of course, this will depend on context and situation, even how well rested you are, etc. But that's exactly the point. This is the sort of thing you want to do every time you decide to do a meditation practice. In fact, I would suggest that you use this to determine what meditation you do at any given moment. So let's say you are somebody who is a regular meditator, or let's say you're somebody who's never meditated and you'd like to develop a meditation practice. I suggest that you do a test of whether or not you are more interoceptively dominant or exteroceptively dominant in that moment. Okay? This is not a personality trait. This is a question about where you happen to be in a moment. So let's say you're on a plane or you're in the car. If you're in the car, please don't close your eyes while driving. That's sort of obvious. But do this in a safe way, please. But stop, close your eyes, and assess whether or not you can access and focus your attention primarily on your internal state, or whether or not your attention and perception gets pulled to something external, to exteroception. And again, that will vary depending on circumstance and who you are. Then I suggest opening your eyes and trying to focus your attention to something external to you, and seeing or evaluating the extent to which you can divorce your perception from sensations that occur at the level of your skin or internally. Now, I should say that there's no technology, at least not that I'm aware of, absence of fMRI machine, in which case you are inside an fMRI machine while you do this. But unless you are in that experiment, and most of us aren't, there's no technology that can tell you, for instance, whether or not you are interoceptively dominant or exteroceptively dominant, and whether or not the ratio is 75 to 25 or what have you at any given moment. You have to assess this subjectively. However, if you sit down, for instance, and you notice that you can equally split your attention between internal sensations and external sensations, or whether or not you find yourself pulled into external sensations when you're trying to focus inward, or you find yourself pulled inward when you're trying to focus outward, well, that will dictate the sort of meditation that you perhaps ought to perform in that moment. Let me give an example of how you would do this. You would stop in some way, so sit or lie down, close your eyes, and evaluate whether or not you can essentially rule out or eliminate attention to all outside events. Most people won't be able to do that entirely, but try and focus your attention, for instance, on your breathing or the typical third eye center, focusing at a spot right behind your forehead. If you feel you can do that reasonably well to the exclusion of what's happening around you, well then, an important question arises. Should you meditate in a way to enhance that interoceptive awareness? Or rather, should you meditate in a way, for instance, with your eyes open and your attention on a particular portion of the landscape you're in, like a tree or maybe even an object or a plant or something else in your immediate environment, to try and cultivate or enhance your exteroceptive awareness? That's up to you, but my bias would be one in which you work against your default state. Again, the default mode network is where you land on this interoceptive, exteroceptive continuum is going to lead to more mind wandering. Whereas when you encourage, or we could even say force yourself a little bit to anchor your attention to either inside your body or outside your body, and you make that decision according to what you are doing less easily, well then you are actively training up the neural circuits. You are engaging so-called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change in response to experience. You are deliberately engaging a shift along that continuum. To make this crystal clear, what I mean is this. Let me give an example. If I were to sit down and I want to do some meditation, let's just say 3 minutes of meditation. There's good evidence that even 3 minutes of meditation can be beneficial for a variety of things, including enhanced focus and enhanced anxiety management. Let's say I sit down and I notice that I can really focus inward on what's happening at the level of my skin and my internal organs. And I can rule out everything. Maybe that's because the room is quiet, or maybe it's just because my brain is in a state that I'm particularly good at that moment. Or maybe it's just a natural ability. Well, then I would opt for a 3-minute meditation practice in which I deliberately exterocept, that I build up the circuitry to focus on something external to me. Because I want, and I think most people would like, to have an adaptive mechanism within them so that they can slide along that continuum and they don't default to whatever happens to be easiest for them in that moment. Now, if I were to sit down and try and focus on what's going on internally, and I kept getting distracted by things happening outside of me, opening my eyes or feeling like I need to reach for my phone or paying attention to the sounds in the room, Well, then I would actively engage a meditation practice, in this case, a 3-minute example, but it could be longer, where I'm deliberately trying to focus my perception on events at the level of the confines of my skin and internally. Why do I say this? Well, I love to use the phrase anytime with kids, when they say, this is really hard or something's challenging, or adults will say, that's really tough. Well, as my graduate advisor used to say, that means you're learning. If something were easy, if you can perform any activity or thought, etc., well, then there is absolutely zero reason for your neural circuits to change. It's the friction, it's the feeling that something is hard that turns on the enormous variety of mechanisms at the level of cells, etc., that allow you to potentially change your neural circuitry. So challenge and discomfort is the signal to your brain and body that something needs to change. So I'm encouraging you to embark on meditative practices that are not your default, okay, to essentially go against the grain of where your interoceptive bias or your exteroceptive bias happens to be at a given moment. And again, this will change. For some of you, this will change across the day, where early in the day you are very, very good at doing an interoceptive biased meditation, and later in the day you aren't. I actually believe, based on the data that I've covered, and we'll get into a few more papers about this, and my lab is actively working on this as well, that a meditative practice can be made far more effective. That is, it can invoke more neuroplasticity, more shift in brain states and brain circuitry if we do not take the easy path. That is, we go against the grain of what our brain would naturally do in a given moment. So if you're in a crowded airport and you're finding that everything's very distracting, well then that would be a great time to do some interoceptive focused meditation. Whereas if you are really in your head, you're looping thoughts about the past and present, maybe you're even in obsessive thought, well, that would be a terrific time, an ideal time really, to do a short meditation focused on something external to you. In both cases, whether or not you're focused on interoceptive bias or exteroceptive bias, you are going against, or I should say you're pushing back against your default mode network. I would argue it's going to be far more effective. That is, you're going to reduce or shift the activity of that default mode network far more. My experience of the Waking Up app has led to my most consistent meditation practice. And of course, I would love to get Sam on the podcast as a guest so we could talk about the sort of underpinnings of the Waking Up app and his views. Check it out. I want to talk just briefly about this third eye center business because it turns out to be pretty interesting. The third eye is actually a name that's been given to another neural structure, or I should say structure because it's not strictly neural, and that's the pineal gland. And this has an interesting history. I promise I'm not taking off on a tangent here that isn't relevant to meditation. So you have a brain, of course, and on both sides of your brain, you tend to have mirror symmetric representations of the same things. What do I mean by that? Well, you have a prefrontal cortex on the right, you have a prefrontal cortex on the left, and they actually do slightly different things. Language is sometimes lateralized to one side, but in general, for every structure that you have on one side of the brain, you have the same structure on the opposite side of the brain. There's one clear exception to that, and that's the pineal gland. The pineal gland is the gland that makes melatonin, which at night, when it gets dark, secretes melatonin, and that melatonin makes you sleepy. It helps you fall asleep but not stay asleep. Descartes, right, the philosopher Descartes, asserted that the pineal was the seat of the soul because it was the one structure in the brain that he saw was not on both sides of the brain. It was only one of them and in the middle. Now, I don't know if it's the seat of the soul or not. I'm not in a position to make assessments like that. But what do we know about the pineal? The pineal, as I mentioned, is involved in releasing melatonin. It does a few other things as well. But it is also considered the third eye for a couple of reasons. One is that it responds to light, although in humans not directly. So in birds and lizards and snakes, they actually either have a thin skull or, believe it or not, two holes in the top of their skull that allow light to go directly in. If you look at the head of a snake, light can go directly into their brain through these holes and activate the pineal to suppress melatonin and control their wakefulness, sleep rhythms. In birds, they don't have holes in their skull, but they have very thin skulls. And believe it or not, light can penetrate the thinness of the skull in many birds and communicates information about time of day and even time of year. And that's translated into hormonal signals such as melatonin release from the pineal. And so the pineal has been called the third eye because it's a light-sensitive organ inside the brain. In humans, the pineal sits deep, deep, deep to the surface, and light cannot get in there. In fact, if light can get into your brain, unless you are part of a specific experiment where that's the intention, or you're having neurosurgery or something of that sort, then you've got serious issues happening. That pineal sits deep, deep, deep near what's called the fourth ventricle, and it absolutely should not see light directly. So the idea that the pineal is the third eye in humans is not true. It just isn't true. So anytime someone says, oh, the pineal is your third eye, that's not the third eye center that people are referring to when they talk about meditation. Now, you'll see a number of different forms of art where somebody will, it will be a picture of a face and the eyes will be closed, or sometimes open. There'll be literally a third eye, like a cyclops eye in the middle of the forehead. That has been proposed for many thousands of years to be, quote unquote, the seat of our consciousness. Now that's interesting because that real estate behind the forehead actually turns out to be the prefrontal cortex, which we know from lesion studies and stimulation studies. If you remove that brain area, people become very reflexive. They are not thinking intentionally. They don't become deliberate. In fact, and this is kind of an eerie result, but if you inactivate, you turn off the prefrontal cortex, and you give somebody the opportunity to play a shooting game, for instance, their accuracy goes through the roof. They become essentially like a machine. They see a stimulus, they shoot at it. They see a stimulus, they shoot at it. Their accuracy is exceptional, but their ability to distinguish between enemy and friend completely disappears. So they become a highly effective motor, or I should say sensory motor machine, but their assessment and their judgment about right or wrong completely disappears. This is also true for people that have prefrontal damage. They often will have inappropriate behavior or a hard time suppressing behaviors, etc. So the third eye center as the seat of consciousness and our intention is something that makes sense generally with what we know about the neuroscience and neurology. But there's something more to it that I think is especially important for all of you that goes beyond anything about ancient traditions or pineals or birds or snakes and pits in the top of the head. And here's what it is. The brain itself, meaning the brain tissue, does not have any sensory neurons. What do I mean by that? Well, if I touch the top of my hand, I can feel that. If I want to sense my heartbeat, if I work at it, I can feel that. If I want to sense how I feel internally at the level of my stomach, is it full, is it empty, am I hungry, is it acidic, does it ache, or does it feel pleasant, etc., I can sense that. And that's because we have sensory neurons on our skin and in our body, etc. We also have sensory neurons in our eyes that let us perceive things externally. We have no sensory neurons on our brain. This is one of the reasons why you can remove the skull and do brain surgery on somebody who's wide awake and be poking around in there, and they don't need any anesthetic on the brain itself. They need anesthetic for the incision site, but they don't need anesthetic on the brain because it has no feeling. You have emotions, but there's no feeling. So normally we are perceiving and paying attention to what we are sensing, either externally, sights and sounds, again, exteroception, or internally, interoception, touch, etc. But by focusing our perception and our attention not on our bodily surface like a body scan, but to a point a couple centimeters or inches behind our forehead, we essentially are bringing that attentional, that perceptual spotlight to a location in which there is no sensation. There's nothing to feel there. And when we do that by closing our eyes and focusing on that quote-unquote third eye center, which is the prefrontal cortex, to be quite honest, when we do that, something else happens. And what happens is when we are not thinking about and perceiving our sensations, because there are none there, our thoughts and our emotions and our memories sort of mushroom up. A better way to put it would be that they geyser up and take on more prominence in our perception. What I mean by this is that normally, I'm not thinking about the contact point between me and this chair, but as I'm speaking, I'm in contact with the chair and those neurons are firing. But if I focus my energy and attention on them, they're going to fire the same, but more of my perception goes there. Similarly, I'm thinking things all the time, you are too, and I'm perceiving things all the time, and I'm remembering things all the time, and I'm anticipating things all the time about the future. But by focusing my attention on the one organ for which I have no sensation, that is my brain, well then, thoughts, feelings, and memories, feelings meaning emotional feelings, start to grow in their prominence, in my awareness and in my perception. And so this is why when you sit down to a meditative practice, if it's a meditative practice where you close your eyes or you're focused on that third eye center, where you're focused on your brain as opposed to your bodily surface or something external to you, the thoughts seem to come by in waves, and they can almost be overwhelming. It's very hard to, as it's often described, just sit back and watch your thoughts go by because there are so many of them. Actually, the best way to stop thinking is to really focus on something external or to focus on sensation. That's less thinking than it is perceiving senses. Okay, so I don't want this to get too abstract. When people talk about the third eye center, they're not talking about the pineal, they're talking about prefrontal cortex. And when you direct your own attention to the very area of your brain that directs attention, there's nothing to sense there. The only things that will become present to you are feelings, emotions, that is, thoughts, and memories. And they will often arrive in what seems to be a very disorganized fashion. And the reason they arrive in somewhat disorganized fashion is because normally we just don't perceive things that way. Normally we are splitting our attention, our perception that is, to multiple things, our sensation and our thoughts. When we put all of our perception into our thoughts, we see how disorganized, how wandering they are, and how, in fact, how random and intrusive those can be. Again, random and intrusive. And much of what we talked about in that paper earlier, the one where they asked people, what are you doing and what are you feeling and how happy or how unhappy you are, what they discovered was that most people are sort of in their head a lot. They're not really present to what they're doing, which leads me to the statement that I believe, at least based on the data, that paper included, that most people have an interoceptive bias. They're focused more on what's going on internally than they are focused on what's happening externally. There are certainly people who, or the opposite is true, but I think that this is an issue because we hear so often about the need to do a meditation practice that allows us to focus inward, and that we're getting yanked around by all the stressors of life, et cetera, et cetera. And we are. We're getting yanked around by all the stressors and demands of life. But as we do that, we tend to be very focused on what's happening with us. The data clearly point to the fact that being mindful and being aware can enhance one's level of presence and happiness. But we can go so far as to say that being mindful and aware of what's happening, not just with us, but external to us in our immediate environment, that includes what other people are saying and doing, that also can really enhance our sense of well-being and happiness. At least that's what the data point to. Let's briefly recap where we've been so far. We've talked a little bit about the brain networks that are activated during meditation, which include prefrontal cortex, ACC, the insula. We also talked about the difference between interoception and exteroception and the importance of assessing where you are along that continuum. And I should mention, of course, that you can be right in the middle of that continuum. You might sit down to do meditation and find that you are smack dab in the middle of being able to attend to things outside of you, but also attending to things inside of you, in which case I suggest doing a meditation that is either exteroceptive biased or interoceptive biased. But as I mentioned earlier, if you find that you are more, quote unquote, in your head or in your body, well then focus on an exteroceptive biased meditation to build up that set of circuits. Whereas if you are more exteroceptively focused at any given moment, well then I encourage you to do an interoceptively focused meditation practice. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this issue of how long to do a practice. There are a lot of different data on these, but some of the practices we've covered on this podcast before when we had guests, for instance, highlighted the 13-minute meditation that Dr. Wendy Suzuki from New York University's laboratory has popularized, and they popularized it because they have a wonderful paper that we will provide a link to, which shows that a daily 13-minute meditation, which is of the traditional third eye, interoceptively biased, focus on breathing and focus on that location directly behind one's forehead or both, that meditation done daily for about 8 weeks, maybe shorter, but in that study, 8 weeks, greatly improved mood, improved ability to sleep, improved cognitive ability and focus, memory. A huge number of metrics were looked at very specifically. So that's a terrific one. And you may be asking yourself, do you need to do the full 13 minutes? Could you get away with 5 minutes or 3 minutes? Well, my laboratory has shown benefits in stress reduction, improvement in sleep, etc., with a 5 minute a day meditation. However, in trying to establish how long you should meditate, I would ask yourself a couple of questions. First of all, what is a practice that you can do consistently? And by consistently, that doesn't necessarily mean every day. If you answer the question about consistency honestly, and you find that you can only do one meditation session per week, well, then I would encourage you to go a little bit longer, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, maybe even 30 minutes. Again, understanding that you're going to have to refocus repeatedly throughout that meditation, regardless of whether or not you're focusing on internal perceptions or external perceptions. If, however, you can set aside 5 or 10 or 15 minutes per day, and you can meditate every day, well, then I think you have a little bit more flexibility in terms of how long you meditate. Maybe it's 3 minutes one day, 1 minute the next day, 10 minutes the next, and so on and so forth. Just like with exercise, the key component is consistency. And this is borne out in all the data that's covered in Altered Traits. It's also borne out in all the recent studies that have come out since that book was published. Consistency is key. So ask yourself what you can do consistently, and also don't necessarily burden yourself with always having to do the same amount or duration of meditation. So earlier we decided we were going to parse or fine slice the meditation practice, and indeed we've been doing that. We've talked about interoceptive versus exteroceptive bias, and we've been talking about where you place your perception or your focus. Another key component of meditation is the pattern of breathing that you embrace. In fact, the pattern of breathing that you embrace during your meditation practice can itself be its own form of meditation. What do I mean by that? Well, these days we hear a lot about breath work. Breath work has really grown in popularity in the last 5-10 years, and there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, I think we need to credit Wim Hof, or can we call him, I think appropriately, the great Wim Hof. You know, certainly there were people before Wim who were doing deliberate breath work and talking about deliberate breath work, but it was really about 2015 or so that Wim Hof started to grow in recognition and popularity for a particular style of breathing, which in the laboratory we call cyclic hyperventilation. I know there are other names for it that come from ancient traditions. He named it, or people named it after him, Wim Hof. Wim Hof, for those of you that don't know, is a Dutchman who is known to hold many world records for deliberate cold exposure, including swimming under icebergs, longest period of time buried in ice up to his neck, etc., but who's also expert in the use of breathing in particular ways in order to manage and maneuver through those challenges. And he started speaking about different patterns of breath work, in particular the use of cyclic hyperventilation, deep, deliberate breathing, so big inhales, exhales, big inhales, exhales. In the laboratory, again, we call that cyclic hyperventilation. It's very clear from studies both done on WIM specifically, but on the general population as well by my lab and other labs, that pattern of cyclic hyperventilation, of deliberately breathing deeply and repetitively, typically in through the nose, out through the mouth, generates a lot of adrenaline, or causes adrenaline release from the brain and body. It, quote unquote, heats up the body. Indeed, it raises body temperature, but the liberation of adrenaline does a number of things to shift the state of the brain and body. That more or less is what Wim Hof breathing is, although Wim Hof breathing, or some people will call it tumo breathing or cyclic hyperventilation, is not a pattern of breathing typical of most meditations that have been discussed, at least not in the research literature. Now, that's not to say that cyclic hyperventilation can't be incorporated into a meditation practice, but Wim Hof breathing, aka cyclic hyperventilation tumo, is typically considered its own practice, okay, its own breathwork practice, divorced from meditation. It might have a meditative component, but it's not often discussed as meditation or as part of meditation. More typically, a meditation practice involves slowing one's breathing, and this could be in the form of cyclic breathing of inhale, exhale, which is cyclic, or in some cases doubling up on inhales and then exhaling. So inhale, exhale, exhale, or controlling the duration of inhale, breath hold, exhale, breath hold, repeat, so-called box breathing, where the inhale, the hold, the exhale, and the hold are of equivalent durations. Any number of different breathing patterns, slow cyclic breathing, box breathing, a cadence of 3 to 6 seconds in, holding for 2 seconds, and 7 seconds out. Regardless of what cadence of breathing one uses, there is a tendency during most meditative practices to slow one's breathing and or control one's breathing in deliberate fashion. This is essential because when we default our breathing, that is, when we don't pay attention to how long we are inhaling relative to our exhales, when we don't deliberately exhale, that is, normally we just passively exhale, but we actively inhale. I repeat that. Normally, when we're not thinking about breathing, we deliberately inhale. There's a motor command that's sent to inflate the lungs, and then we passively exhale. But in many breathwork practices or meditation practices, we actually actively exhale as well. Well, when we do that, a number of things happen. First of all, it forces us into interoception. Why? Because the diaphragm, the muscle that helps move the lungs essentially and create a specific cadence of breathing or depth of breathing, as one would with box breathing or deliberately slow breathing. Well, that muscle resides inside of us, and so when we focus on our breathing, more often than not, we aren't focused on the actual air leaving our nasal passages or mouth, maybe a little bit, but more typically we are forced to focus, or we just default to focusing on the movement of our diaphragm or of our belly or the rising and falling of our chest. All of that is to say that by deliberately focusing on our breathing, we shift to interoception. So breathing and specific patterns of breathing sort of along for the ride in meditation. But the reverse can also be said, that when we focus on our breathing, we shift to interoception and away from external events. Doesn't mean we can't still pay attention to external events. We can still exterocept, but at least some portion of our perception, of our attention, shifts to interoception. So we, of course, need to breathe to stay alive. We have to breathe at least every so often in order to stay alive. So, of course, breathing is part of any meditative practice, just like it's part of any living activity, even sleep. But if the first component of meditation is to direct our perception in a deliberate way, using that prefrontal cortex to a specific location, either on the surface of or within our body, or external to our body, or both, but typically one or the other, then we can say that the second element of a meditative practice is the pattern of breathing, and we can ask ourselves, can it and should it be deliberate or not? In other words, do we just default to however we happen to be breathing? Or should it be deliberate? That is, should we be controlling the depth and the cadence? And I do believe that based on what we know about the capacity for specific patterns of breathing to shift our brain state, that controlling one's pattern of breathing during meditation can be enormously useful, and that is true regardless of whether or not one is focusing on interoceptive perceptions within our body or exteroceptive perceptions. So that raises the question, how should we breathe during meditation? Well, there's, again, no simple one-size-fits-all rule there, but there are some general rules of respiration physiology that can help us access and develop a meditation practice that is going to best serve our goals. And since this is not an episode all about respiration, and we will do one, but I simply want to give you the basics of what respiration can do to shift your brain and body state. Before I do that, however, I want to give a very specific instruction, which is when you sit down to meditate, or if you're going to do your meditation walking, that's fine too. I should just say when you are about to begin your meditative practice, you need to ask yourself a question. Do you want to be more relaxed than you are at present, or do you want to be more alert than you are at present when you exit the meditation practice? Do you want to calm down, or do you want to become more alert? Simple question. You can decide from session to session. You could even switch within a session. But just as you need to assess whether or not you are leaning more interoceptively or exteroceptively, you also need to ask yourself, do you need to calm down or want to calm down, or do you want to be more alert?